Welcome to Ignatius Press, off the shelf. I think we have some over there. I think some. Oh, no, there they are behind Vivian. Those are part of our Chesterton collection. And we're going to discuss what could be arguably uh, his most important work, his most famous work, although there's a lot of candidates for that, The Everlasting Man. The latest version we have of it, Ignatius Press, is in this not very attractive cover, Everlasting Man. And we'll give the page references from there, but I am going to use my old copy. As I said, our last episode on Augustine, and I've taught this for 50 years now. This particular volume by Ignatius Press was published in 1986, so I've only done 38 years with this volume. But this volume has the great advantage of including two other small works, Francis of Assisi and St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas. And I really recommend, if you don't have it yet, get this volume, volume 5, I think it is, no, volume 2 of his collected works, because then you get all three of these. Great bonus. So let's begin. Joseph, you're going to be the lead here, but I probably will interrupt many times because this is, we both share this as one of our favorite books of all time. But go ahead, Joseph.
Yes, it's a bit of a role reversal as well, Father, because when you and I teach at Avonmere University, I teach Napoleon, a man it was Thursday, and you teach the Everlasting Man, and I interrupt you. So the roles are reversed, but interrupt as often as you like. What I did want to begin with, just looking at the prefatory note on page 7, where he says he references H.G. Wells very politely. And the reason for that is this book was prompted or provoked by H.G. Wells's famous best-selling work of history, The Outline of History, which was an international bestseller and basically is an atheistic understanding of human history. There is no God. It's all about progress towards a golden age in the future, ushered in by science. So it's very much a materialistic, progressivist understanding of history. Now, Hilaire Belloc responded to that with his customary bellicosity and wrote a book called A Companion to H.G. Wells' Outline of History, in which he debunked basically Wells's thesis and his facts. Wells was stung into writing a response called Mr. Belloc Objects. He wrote a book called Mr. Belloc Objects, and then Belloc wrote another book, Mr. Belloc Still Objects. And Belloc claimed to have written over 100,000 words in refutation of Wells's book. But the point is that Wells and Belloc there's a lot of animosity in their approach to each other. There was no love lost. There was an enmity, and what we see here, I think, is this is typical of Chesterton. I talk about the difference between Bellocian bellicosity and Chestertonian charity. Here we see Chesterton's doing the same thing as Belloc. He's refuting Wells's argument, and yet he begins by praising Wells and doesn't mention him again afterwards. And it's a book basically which is full of charity. And Wells and Chesterton remain friends. Belloc and Wells certainly didn't. So I think this is an example of Chesterton's charity, his sanctity, his approach to argument that doesn't become a quarrel.
And don't you think his sense of humor has a lot to do with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's one thing. This book is very powerful, I think, as an argument, is because it's not a quarrel. It's not. It doesn't succumb to anger or a lack of charity. And then beyond that, I just wanted to. I don't know if we need to. Where am I? I'm looking at the wrong thing here.
While you're finding where you are,
yeah.
This was also in his charity and his generosity or courtesy. Chesterton recognizes that Wells had a tremendous grasp of historical facts, but Wells called his book The Outline of History. And what Chesterton said, he had wonderful facts. It's only wrong as an outline. He's got the proportions wrong. That's the difference, And then a couple of times now at the beginning here, he'll explain what he's doing. And on that page 7, Joseph, at the very beginning, he says, two things. One, the view suggested here is historical rather than theological. So he recognizes that he's going to take a view of God and the world that is historical primarily, but it's theological as well. But that's his view is historical. And then middle of that prefatory note, he says, its thesis. What's the thesis of this book? Its thesis is that those who say that Christ stands side by side with similar myths and his religion side by side with similar religions are only repeating a very stale formula, contradicted by a very striking fact. His whole point here is to show how man stands out from the animals in a qualitative way, and Christ stands out from men in a qualitative way. That's how he divides the book into two parts.
Yeah, exactly. And in the introduction, he says towards the bottom of page 13, about 8 lines up, I have therefore divided this book into two parts, the former being a sketch of the main adventure of the human race insofar as it remained heathen, and the second a summary of the real difference that was made by it becoming Christian, which is why the first book begins with the man in the cave, the caveman, and the second half of the book begins with the God in the cave in Bethlehem. So that's what he's doing, basically saying that the incarnation changes everything. It's a bit like the Old Testament and the New Testament, that we don't only understand the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. We only understand pre-Christian history in the light of the incarnation. So that's basically what he's saying here.
And I want to very quickly jump ahead to page 17 to the top because he says something on this very topic. He says, I do desire to help the reader to see Christendom from the outside in the sense of seeing it as a whole against the background of other historic things. So to see Christianity against the background of humanity, so to speak, just as I desire him to see humanity as a whole against the background of natural things. So there it is again. Man against natural things, Christianity against historical things, or
Yeah,
standing
and on
out.
that page 17 there, he says, we have to react against the heavy bias of fatigue. It's almost impossible to make the facts vivid because the facts are familiar. And for fallen men, it's often true that familiarity is fatigue. And in Tolkien's famous essay on fairy stories, he talks about one of the gifts that fantasy fairy stories give us is the gift of recovery, to recover a clear view, because of this fatigue we don't see things in the clarity of the brilliance of God's giving it to us. We sort of take it for granted, and then when we take something for granted we don't see it at all. And so we have to recover this clear view, to use Tolkien's words. And that again, there's so much when we read the Everlasting Man, there's so much we can see how it influences both Tolkien and Lewis in particular.
And on that very point, on page, let's see, my page 148, it'll be your page 70, 60, page 14, about 10 lines down. When its fundamentals are doubted as at present, we must try to recover, there's that word, recover the candor and wonder of the child, the unspoiled realism and objectivity of innocence. And the end of that paragraph, beautiful paradox, we must invoke the most wild and soaring sort of imagination, the imagination that can see what is there.
Yep.
I love that.
Yeah, beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
But why is that so beautiful? Why is it paradox? Because to take Chesterton example, which then Tolkien uses of a horse, I mean, if all you see is a horse is something that you can sit on, or get you from point A to point B, you've lost the idea of a horse. But when you talk a myth of Pegasus, the flying horse, oh my gosh, there's a flying horse. Then you realize, oh my gosh, the fact that a horse can walk is already something, isn't it? So
Yeah,
the imagination of Pegasus allows us to see horses for what they are with the innocence of a child. That's Chesterton. On to the first
yeah,
chapter.
yeah. So I'm comfortable in from the perspective of obviously needing to move on for the most part of just giving a general overview of it. And then we can quote selectively, each of us maybe whatever we want to talk to. But the key
Okay.
thing about the man in the cave is is what I think Lewis comes up with with the term chronological snobbery, but that we look back upon our ancient ancestors with a very supercilious chronological snobbery, just assuming that because they're in the distant past, they must be primitive and inferior to us. And and so he talks about all these, you know, modern novelists finding the caveman in them, which means basically acting like an absolute animal and in a bestial fashion. He said, "Well, let's look at the evidence. Let's go into the cave and look at the evidence, and let's be really scientific. What do we find in the cave? We don't find piles of skulls neatly cracked like eggs. What we do find is art." And so, there's some wonderful quotes about it which we can use. But the key thing is what he says: we go back as far as we could possibly go to the actual scientific, real evidence, not the fantasies of chronological snobbery and Freudianism and the rest of it. What we find is good art on the walls of the cave. And what does that mean? It means there's an abyss that separates the caveman from the creatures he's painting, because he's a creator, he's an artist, and there's not an abyss between us and him, because we are essentially the same as human persons who are creators and artists. And so that is the key to this. I think that when I first read this, I was blown away. It really changed my whole perspective when I first read this chapter. I know I was no longer progressive. From that moment onwards, about the whole notion of progress is nonsense. There's a permanence to what it is to be human, and that changed everything for me. So this book was crucial on my own progress to Christianity.
Joseph, I don't want to miss the opportunity before we finish this episode and this chapter to have you illustrate this, what you just said, by reading a long passage starting in the middle of page 37 about birds building nests.
Mhm.
For the very fact that birds do build nests, would you read that until the end of the paragraph on the next page?
So whereabouts does it begin, Father?
The
Sorry.
the middle of 37.
The very fact that a bird could, right to the end of the paragraph, I can certainly do that. Okay. The very fact that a bird can get as far as building a nest and cannot get any further proves that he has not a mind as man has a mind. It proves it more completely than if he built nothing at all. If he built nothing at all, he might possibly be a philosopher of the quietist or Buddhistic school, indifferent to all but the mind within. But when he builds as he does build and is satisfied and sings aloud with satisfaction, then we know there is really an invisible veil, like a pane of glass, between him and us, like the window on which a bird will beat in vain. But suppose our abstract onlooker saw one of the birds begin to build as men build. Suppose in an incredibly short space of time there were 7 styles of architecture for one style of nest. Suppose the bird carefully selected forked twigs and pointed leaves to express the piercing piety of Gothic, but turned to broad foliage and black mud when he sought in a darker mood to call up the heavy columns of Bel and Ashtaroth, making his nest indeed one of the hanging gardens of Babylon. Suppose the bird made little clay statues of birds celebrated in letters or politics and stuck them up in front of the nest. Suppose that one bird out of 1,000 birds began to do one of the 1,000 things that man had already done even in the morning of the world, and we could be quite certain that the onlooker would not regard such a bird as a mere evolutionary variety of the other birds. He would regard it as a very fearful wildfowl indeed, possibly as a bird of ill omen, certainly as an omen. That bird would tell the augurs not of something that would happen, but of something that had happened. That something would be the appearance of a mind with a new dimension of depth, a mind like that of man. If there be no God, no other mind could conceivably have foreseen it.
And here's exactly how he exemplifies this, because people will say, well, look at, you say man is higher because he built things, homo faber, but animals build things. Beavers build dams and birds build nests. and says, "Oh yes, well let's use our imagination. Yes, birds build nests, but if they built nests like we do things, we would be pretty struck. There'd be something pretty odd about that, supernatural about it, basically."
There's a great line that sums that up on page 26 toward the bottom of the middle paragraph. Chesterton says, "Man is not merely an evolution, but rather a revolution."
Yeah.
Just as the bird building Gothic birds' nests would be a revolution, not an evolution.
Speaking of evolution, on page 24, uh, towards the bottom, but maybe 7 lines down the new paragraph there, about evolution. As a matter of fact, it is not touching these primary things having to do with the origin of living matter and everything. A very practical word, a very powerful idea. Nobody can imagine how nothing could turn into something. Nobody can get an inch near to it by explaining how something could turn into something else. So that's a very important philosophical thing.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you really can't imagine real nothingness and then something there without an external cause. But to go from more to less, to go from one to another, that's going from nothing to something in a certain sense. And he 4 lines down from the bottom of the page, he says, "But evolution really is a mistaken explanation." It's not an explanation. Uh, Next page, 25, I guess. It is an illogicality as well as an illusion. For slowness has really nothing to do with the question. An event is not any more intrinsically intelligible or unintelligible because of the pace at which it moves. Anyway, and by the way, he doesn't deny evolution. I don't know if I have it here. I'll get to it
No,
somewhere.
he says that he's not interested one way or the other about whether it's true. That's not relevant to his case, and that's what I always say to people, that whether or not evolution is true is irrelevant to me theologically in my belief in God. But the point is that one speck of dust, just one speck of dust, is a huge mystery, because it's a something that's come into being from nothing. And there's something as opposed to nothing. That's the big question, not how a speck of dust might combine with other specks of dust to become a stone. I mean, that's not the key issue. How did the speck of dust come into being in the first place is the question.
And what he does take apart, leaving whether or not evolution happens or not completely aside, what he does take apart are the false arguments that somehow prove it. And one of the arguments used to prove evolution is the fact that this was a very slow development. And what Father just read is taking apart how does that prove anything, whether something's slow or fast?
Right.
That's immaterial to the question. And he does that so brilliantly, uh, leaving aside the question of itself, but going after all the arguments that are used to so-called prove
And
it,
some
don't
time
prove it.
back in our previous iteration here, when we looked at Father Spitzer's book, Science at the Doorstep of God, he did actually show that the universe is not old enough for these probabilities to have come into being. So even if you want to look in terms of time, it doesn't work. But on a philosophical, existential level, it's not relevant anyway.
Right.
And just above where you quoted, Vivian, about a man is a revolution rather than evolution.
On page 26.
Yeah, just a few lines above that, maybe two-thirds down the page. The matter here is one of history, not philosophy. So it need only be noted that no philosopher denies that a mystery still attaches to the two great transitions: the origin of the universe itself, that is from nothing to something, and the origin of the principle of life itself, from inanimate to animate, or from inorganic to organic. Most philosophers have the enlightenment to add a third mystery attached to the origin of man himself, human life, rational animal from other animals.
Mhm.
Uh, and then page 33, it just kind of sums what you said, Joseph. Uh, the bottom of the paragraph at the top there, the art is the signature, something of division and disproportion has appeared, and it is unique. art is the signature of man. I mean, that's
Mhm.
this whole first chapter is that looking at man compared to what went before him in the cosmos on the planet, we find something which wasn't there before. And the first thing we find is art. And art is something which we find no comparable reality in what is lower than man on the evolutionary scale.
Right.
Yeah, and if you go back 2 pages from that, Father, page 32, it's very connected to it. About 8 lines down on that page 32. The brotherhood of man is even nobler when it bridges the abyss of ages, than when it bridges only the chasm of class. And again, for me, this brotherhood of man, when I can consider a caveman to be my brother because he's an artist, and you compare that with our modern progressive cancel culture.
Mhm.
Whereas anybody who lived more than 30 years ago is ipso facto a primitive bigot because the past is primitive and bigoted, right? So there's no love of neighbor there. There's a hatred and loathing of everybody who happened to be born in the previous generation and further back thereafter. So basically you hate the whole of humanity except for the little passing transient clique of which you happen to be a member.
So I think we've covered the main theme for certain of the first chapter, and we've had a couple of examples of the beauty of expression, uh, the poetry, if you will, of Chesterton in expressing this. You want to go into chapter 2 now, Joseph, or is there more in chapter
Sure,
1?
absolutely, yeah.
So you want to give us your overview of that, two professors and prehistoric men?
Yeah, this is basically where he then looks at. He stated the principle, of course, of the fact that we have a great deal in common with our uh, uh, ancient ancestors, who, by the way, he does say, we don't even know they lived in caves any more than we discovered a wine cellar in South London proves that the people of London lived in caves. If they lived in wooden houses, the wooden houses would all have decayed years ago, and we would have no trace of them. Clearly, the only thing left is the bit that doesn't decay. So they may have used the cave as an art gallery and lived in wooden houses, for all we know. So to say they lived in caves, it's just not. It refutes the evidence. So this brings us on to professors and prehistoric men, because where he looks at the misperceptions of science in inverted commas, scientism, the arrogance of scientific thinking when applied to our ancient ancestors, and he basically shows the foolishness of it. That's essentially what this chapter is about. I mean, I could give one or two examples, but I'm quite happy to defer if you have. I think I've only got things on 42 and 43, but if you have other pages, let's take a look at those.
Well, there's a principle here that he's illustrating. When science attempts to uh, give us an idea or a picture, an image of the earliest man, human being, uh, there's a problem with calling it science. At page 40, where he begins the chapter, he says science is weak about these prehistoric things in a way that has hardly been noticed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The science whose modern marvels we all admire succeeds by incessantly adding to its data. In all practical inventions, in most natural discoveries, it can always increase evidence by experiment. So there's two ways that science is able to draw its conclusions. One is by getting evidence, and then one is by doing experiments, which gives you more evidence so you can observe. But he says, uh, about three-fourths of the way down, in dealing with a past that is almost entirely perished, he can only go by evidence and not by experiment.
Mhm.
And there is hardly enough evidence to be evidential. That is to say, we don't have much evidence of prehistoric man, precisely because he's prehistoric. So,
And he's an artist. That's it. That's just the point here. And of course, this is the trouble: is that scientism is not scientific; it's philosophical, and it's bad philosophy, because this is all rooted in a false anthropology, right? It's misunderstanding who we are as human beings that allows us to see cavemen as ape men.
Right. I love on 42, but maybe you wanted to say something about 42, Joseph, but
No, no, please, no, no.
in the
I'd rather
middle
you
of
do it.
that
I've
page,
done more than enough talking.
in the middle of 42, he shows how Darwin himself acknowledged the absence of knowledge about many things, where he says, the sincerity of Darwin really admitted this, and that is how we came to use such a term as the missing link. But the dogmatism of Darwinians has been too strong for the agnosticism of Darwin.
Keep it
Yeah,
going.
it's on one
Finish
link has
finish
become
one more
fact.
there.
Finish more?
Yeah.
And men have insensibly fallen into turning this entirely negative term into a positive image. They talk
Yeah.
of searching for the habits and habitat of the missing link, as if one were to talk of being on friendly terms with the gap in a narrative or the hole in an argument, of taking a walk with a non sequitur or dining with an undistributed middle. Yeah, that is classically funny.
Very good. I'm glad.
Chesterton.
I didn't have that part highlighted. I'm glad you. That's also shows Chesterton's great sense of humour.
Yes.
Well, I at the top of the page, I want to quote this because in my childhood, which may have changed in yours, we had these pictures, of, they found,
Lucy or
whatever, and they got a picture of her, and he says at the top, uh, a detailed drawing was reproduced, carefully shaded, to show that the very hairs of his head were all numbered. No uninformed person looking at his carefully lined face and wistful eyes would imagine for a moment that this was a portrait of a thigh bone or of a few teeth and a fragment of a cranium.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
I would like.
I page 43, about three quarters of the way down. If I can just read these three brief sentences.
Sure.
In short, the prehistoric period need not mean the primitive period in the sense of the barbaric or bestial period. It does not mean the time before civilization or the time before arts and crafts. It simply means the time before any connected narratives that we can read. And this I think is crucial because we know from the oldest texts that we have that they are writing about old civilizations, right? And we don't have any texts old enough to know anything about those civilizations except the fact they're alluded to in these more modern texts. So what we do know is there are whole civilizations of humanity that seem to have existed that we no longer have any evidence of. So what we have when you get back anywhere beyond about 3,000 years is a jigsaw puzzle with very few pieces left.
Mhm.
But that means that we're looking at a huge civilized past, and of course this imagination that Tolkien runs
Yes.
with Middle Earth, right? It's set here, but so many tens of thousands of years ago that we no longer have any documentary evidence, but we know that people were living for hundreds of thousands of years, and we know that they were artists, and we know that they did things, and that their houses are all rotten because they're probably made of wood. We don't have them anymore, but nonetheless, there's this huge history which we don't know anything about, which science then presumes because we don't know about it, ipso facto, it doesn't exist, which is a non sequitur to come back to the term just used, right? It does not follow at all that because we no longer have physical evidence of something, therefore it never existed.
And then if you notice, when new discoveries are made, like, for example, that frozen man in the, Italian Alps that had been under a glacier for so long, and when the glacier melted, his remains became visible, and he basically was freeze dried in the ice. So even his clothing was intact, and his tools, and of course everyone was saying, "Oh, we have to rewrite the history books because this man's skills." I mean, based on the carbon dating, how old they figured he was, his skills completely defied the category of the age in which he lived. And so now we have to rewrite the history books. Well, this keeps happening. We have to rewrite the history books whenever we discover something that didn't wasn't known before about people
Yeah.
who lived a long time
Every
ago.
missing fragment explodes what the presumptions are before it's discovered.
Right.
Right.
That's right. That's right. There's a whole city under the city of Phoenix, a whole Adobe city that
Wow.
uh, that while I was living there, I didn't even know anything about it until I went to the museum where you can see down below the city. And that's just it. The sands of time cover these things.
Yeah.
And it's not until somebody digs and happens to dig in the right spot that you just might discover something that was never even known of before this moment.
Yes, indeed.
There's an important aspect of this chapter, more than an aspect. Just as chapter 1 showed art as the signature of man, this chapter is showing religion as the signature of man. And just as in chapter 1, they were trying to show how the fact that animals build things, is a sign of rationality, but it's not. Likewise, here, on page 47, new paragraph, it is commonly affirmed again that religion grew in a very slow and evolutionary manner, and even that it grew not from one cause, but from a combination that might be called a coincidence. Generally speaking, the three chief elements in the combination are first, the fear of the chief of the tribe, second, phenomena of dreams, and third, the sacrifice association of the harvest and the resurrection, symbolizing the growing corn. So just as in chapter 1, they're trying to show that, animals began to build more and more things, and then they eventually became rational. Chapter 2, well, these creatures began to have their dreams, and then they had an authority figure, and then they had this harvest thing, and that's what led to religion. So religion evolved. Joseph, I want to ask you to read one more thing here on page 49, about 7 lines down, saying it needed a certain sort of mind, down to the I guess, well, where it says, well, I'll stop you when it's time to stop. Start reading that for us.
Okay.
And,
It needed a
and
certain
the
sort
point
of
here
mind.
is Chesterton is saying you don't get the idea of religion from putting together these various ideas. The mind has to be there ahead of it. So go ahead.
Mhm.
It needed a certain sort of mind to see that there was anything mystical about the dreams or the dead, as it needed a particular sort of mind to see that there was anything poetical about the skylark or the spring. That mind was presumably what we call the human mind, very much as it exists to this day. For mystics still meditate upon death and dreams as poets still write about spring and skylarks. But there is not the faintest hint to suggest that anything short of the human mind we know feels any of these mystical associations at all. A cow in a field seems to derive no lyrical impulse or instruction from her unrivaled opportunities for listening to the skylark. And similarly, there is no reason to suppose that live sheep will ever begin to use dead sheep as the basis of a system of elaborate ancestor worship.
That's good, I think. So that's just his point. Again, imagination. We can't imagine the cows doing what we've done from the beginning or the sheep doing what we've done from the beginning. I
Yeah.
want to conclude my part at the very end here because this is a great little uh, uh, force foreseeing, I guess, what's come later. Uh, Bottom of page 54. If we are not of those who begin by invoking the divine Trinity, that is, this is not a theological work, he's not going to start with dogma, we must nonetheless invoke a human Trinity because he's already shown in this chapter that the one thing which we know is foundational was the family, man, woman, and child. And see that triangle repeated everywhere in the pattern of the world. For the highest event in history, to which all history looks forward and leads up, is only something that is once the reversal and the renewal of that triangle or rather, it is the one triangle superimposed as to intersect the other, making a sacred pentacle of which, in a mightier sense than that of the magicians, the fiends are afraid. The old Trinity was a father and mother and child. That's the Trinity of the human race, which you see from the very beginning. And it's called the human family. The new is of child and mother and father, and has the name of the Holy Family. It is in no way altered, except in being entirely reversed, just as the world, which is transformed, was not in the least different, except in being turned upside down.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
All right. So for the next session, we are going to read up to chapter 6, I think. Is that correct, Joseph?
Well, it's about 50 or so pages.
We're going to read Man and Mythologies.
Yes. Up to the end of chapter 5.
Right. So 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah.
Chapters 3, 4, and 5 for next session. Thanks, everyone. God bless you.